There's been a lot of arguments about the recent course of mark benched at 120 by JAMB. First, I'd like to know what exactly is the essence of JAMB. Is it a necessary requirement for tertiary admission?
Well, there are a lot of reasons, why examinations are, slated, beyond JAMB, WAEC. The first intention of any examination is really to test the intelligence of any student and his fitness, to gain admission into maybe any tertiary institution. But however, if you look at what is obtainable in advanced countries like United States or in the European countries, for instance, their high school credits, suffice getting admission into any of the tertiary institutions, whether colleges or in the university. So for us to have JAMB, for instance, in our own setting now, underscores one thing, and it's the fact that our secondary school, right from primary school, are really not working. It's one thing that really we must admit. And the government knows that, every examination regulatory bodies knows that, so that it even becomes dangerous, for you to get a secondary school graduate, an high school graduate, and ask such a person, to go directly into the tertiary institution, and you will see it's quite obvious, because even most students, given the falling state of primary and secondary education, they find it really difficult to even have any serious mark, grade point in JAMB. And even at the period where, despite a lot of other complications, they're able to go through JAMB, pass it by crook or by any means, even the university still do not believe that these students are still fit, given the past experiences, and eventually they set up post-JAMB examination to still attempt to screen out some, in relative sense, people who are considered the best in most of those respective examinations, and eventually to also further confirm that there is still disillusionment in the character of our secondary school and the ability to produce intelligent or prospective undergraduates. You still discover that even in your year one, you still take courses that you have done in secondary school. For instance, as a science student, your first year chemistry, your first year physics, are complete repetition of what you do in secondary school, so that they're able to, in fact, lay a basis for you to build, for the real courses within the university. So, however the case may be too, that is just one part of the deal, of the reason those examinations like JAMB and post-JAMB are in fact necessary. There's another aspect to it, and the second aspect is the fact that our tertiary institutions are not sufficient. They lack basic facilities. So that what the admission process entails is, rather than the end of sieving out, worthy undergraduates, what they do really is to screen out people in order to meet the specific requirements of every tertiary institution. So I think those are the basic aims of it's just an attempt to cover up the ineptitude of the government as regarding their inability to perform optimally on the question of investing heavily in the education sector, so that our primary school and secondary school can be what's calling a school. Look at what is happening in Rwanda, for instance. For people who are saying that public education cannot work, public education in Rwanda is giving this private element a run for their money. Most of them are, government didn't even have to force them to close up. They folded up themselves. Because why? Parents found alternative in government-funded, government-funded schools as against the private school who could not even meet up with government standard, and that's the reality of the situation. Only that it's quite unfortunate at this period that the so-called giant of Africa will have to ask it to take lessons from a Rwanda that is relatively economically backward.
Mr. Soweto, do you agree with Juwon? Because in recent times, in the past, there's been a call for the scrapping of JAMB as a body, and then as a process for examination of students. But then he's coming out to say that it's also a necessary requirement into,
It's very difficult to answer the question with a yes or no answer. Because the interesting thing is that as soon as you begin to discuss and analyze JAMB, our admission process and associated crisis, you realize that you begin to touch on the character of the Nigerian state itself, and whether or not all of these artificial structures created to portray unity, you know, and togetherness can actually function in reality. Because when you look at JAMB, JAMB is meant to ensure a uniform standard for admission across the country. That is the central objective of JAMB. But that also conflicts at some point with the right of individual universities to set standards, you know, for their own admission, which is actually within their purview as autonomous institutions, you know. But beyond even that, you and I know that there are multiple requirements for admissions in this country. There is a quota system. When you begin to go to state institutions, you have indigenous and all kinds of sentiments, you know, that drives or determines admission. So that what we are faced with really is a crisis of monstrous dimension. And what is clear to me at this point is that the debate over whether we require JAMB anymore or not cannot continue to go on without taking into cognizance the need to overhaul the entire system. Because now, for those who feel that JAMB should continue to exist, the idea or their opinion or concern is that as soon as you allow individual universities to set their own standard, that defeats the oneness of the university system. And of course, that will also open the door for all kinds of requirements and standards depending on the nature of the university and the environment. Meanwhile, those who insist that the universities must have the right to set their own standard and are therefore pushing for post-UTME TME have their own point, as I've explained. But you have also realized that even with post-UTME, the problem is not resolved. A few years, if not a number of years ago, when post-UTME was mooted as an idea, my organization stood staunchly against it. Not because we were not interested in having a much more meritorious admission process, unlike how JAMB had become, you know, a process for all kinds of mediocrity because of the manipulations. But because we realized that all of these proposals are merely scratching the surface of the problem. There's a building is facing its imminent collapse. An engineer therefore proposes that the solution is to change the roofing and repaint without checking the foundation and other structural issues. We have not resolved the problem, and we predicted that because of that, the post-TME itself would, after a period, succumb to the same rot that overtook JAMB. And I think that we are there today. So that what the Minister of Education has done recently now by restating post-TME does not address the problem. So for me, I think that we need to take the discussion beyond whether JAMB is relevant or not. We should say that our admission process and the examinations, you know, reflect the entire rot in the education sector. And that until we address those rots, wholeheartedly and fundamentally, there's no admission process we adopt or examinations we adopt that would give us the kind of outcome we expect. Because behind the crisis that enveloped JAMB is the fact that you have in our admission process a scramble for limited spaces. And what that means is that all kinds of shortcuts becomes possible. If you go to Ogba, where I think the office of WAEC or so is located, just at their gates are vendors selling WAEC form. At their gates, and I'm putting this publicly if anybody wants to disagree with that. And why are you not going to have that? We have all kinds of miracle centers masquerading as coaching classes. And they have been created mainly by either those who are close to JAMB officials, WAEC officials, or thereabout, simply to give additional leverage to those who pay the right amount. So these are all of the crises. And any place where there is inadequacy, where there is shortage, all of these crises would inevitably thrive. So that before we begin to talk about the roofing, which I consider to be questions of JAMB or not, or postgraduate TME or not, the fundamental problems of inadequate places needs to be resolved, which would therefore mean that, as my colleague has pointed out, that even the secondary schools, will be put on in the right format, which would therefore ensure that the product of those schools will be capable, to be able to go through the admission process without necessarily having to cut corners. So these are the issues that I think that we need to focus on. Otherwise, if the discussion remains between whether pursue TME or not JAMB, we will continue to miss the point. And I challenge those who continue to push for pursue TME as a worthy replacement for JAMB to let us go through and assess all of the admission processes conducted by pursue TME over the past years. The same manipulation, the same nepotism. I know the sister of a friend who has not been able to gain admission for 5 years now. Not because she didn't meet the limit, the requirement, but because as a very staunch Christian, she's not interested in cutting corners and all of that. So that even with pursue TME, if this exists, then what are we talking about?
Juwon, I'd like to know your reactions to the recent 120 benchmark. It seems to me that in recent times we have done our best to lower every standard of our lives as Nigerians. What are your reactions to that?
Okay, like most Nigerians too, I also read with shocking disbelief, but not really that surprising too, that the JAMB cutoff, admission cutoff mark for universities has been brought down to 120. With polytechnics, college of education, about 120, 100, and thereabout. And when I was coming today, I received a phone call, and from a friend, and the guy was lamenting that this is northern agenda, in this quota system, and the northerners naturally used to have the lowest admission cutoff mark. The point is that they just want to give the northerners enough for you to school and the like. So so that even what that pronouncement or reduction in cutoff mark goes way beyond where the confines of the debate on the education sector, but in a way too is begin to point another spotlight into ethno-religious sentiments. But those are just diversions. They are not in fact the major issue. So now, whether you benchmark admission into 120 or 100, we have raised earlier from the first question, it underlies one thing, and I'll take it from two perspectives. For once, we must admit that Buhari's administration has showed two tendencies on a general sense: populism and fascism. We can leave the tendency of fascism for later discussion, but focus on the discussion of populism. Amongst the vast of the youth and admission seekers, there is a general understanding that it is a general understanding on the question of the difficulty in admission process. So that what Buhari really wants to do in this particular situation is, amidst a lot of surrounding controversies of mass unemployment, underfunding of education, horrific starvation, and the likes, he just actually, there is a decision to pick out just one thing or the other to please an already, disillusioned base. You get it? Which is the question of just thoughtlessly announcing reduction you know, in cutoff mark of 120, 100, and the likes. Yeah, but even within that, that statement too, you can still read the same thing, you know, we are talking about as regarding the state of the education sector. Because the reason most institutions set their scores, you know, aside, you know, Soweto raised the fact that institutions has autonomy, you know, in fact, over the conditions upon which, you know, they could admit students. But even beyond that too, you will discover that most of this admission, like I said earlier, the cutoff marks that most universities fix, they are not necessarily because of a high standard in some courses. For instance, it is not the case that the cutoff mark of medicine is higher than economics, probably because medicine is probably better in society than economics, or you require better intelligence in medicine than you would have required in economics. But there is an underlying fact that resources to cater for either of the courses are inadequate, so that you are able to admit in relative to the amount of infrastructure. You get it? Any university has to cater for those courses. So in a situation whereby a university, the College of Medicine in the university can only cater for 50 students, yeah, and you have about 2,000 applications. So even if 1,000 scores 280, you will discover that in order to meet up with the 50 requirements, so resources won't be overstretched. Admission cutoff can in fact be 340. So which means that it's not the case that ordinarily people who even scored lesser, if they had been, you know, adequate resources wouldn't have been considered. So it further underscores what we maintained earlier, that, you know, there is a fundamental problem and the red alert that must really be placed on our education sector. And now ASU is on strike, and one of the demands of ASU is the fact that government is not only underfunding education. They did not even fulfill the agreements they signed with the union in 2013. And what is that agreement? You know, given the general collapse of the universities in particular, there was an agreement to pay 1.3 trillion naira, you know, as emergency intervention, at least to revitalize the already falling and failing structures, you know, in the university. And they are supposed to pay it in a space of about 6 years in installments. So after the government barely paid 200 billion naira, you know, and the union went back to class, since that time, 2014, they did not bother to pay any dime into the university, so that the university, the lecture theaters, you know, lecture theaters and laboratory, they are trying really hard to meet up with the standard of the Middle Ages, you know, and even how should I put it now? Even the halls of residence, you know, are in the real sense competing with some of the best prisons in the world. You know, that is the real situation on our on the campus. So this 120 or 100, or whether, like we said earlier, JAMB is necessary or not, we need to go back to the foundations, to the foundation and the real causes of why we are in this situation. So as long as the government continues to allocate 50 billion naira as capital intervention into the education sector, and find it comfortable, you know, to allocate about 1.1 trillion naira to serve the pockets of just barely 17,300 public political officers, and they are still very much emboldened to allocate about 125 billion naira for, you know, they want to use 125 billion naira to eat snacks during plenary session. First 9 members of National Assembly are going to be using 125 billion naira for a year, just 469 for the purpose of plenary session. They will use it to eat biscuits, water, you know. And yet, the education sector, 50 billion naira, that is supposed to cater for 180 million naira is suffering. So it just underscores the fact that the government really is not interested in the task of nation building as it's underfunded education.
Mr. Soweto, there are lots of concerns that this decision to reduce to 120 was made in favor of the northern region, northern part of the country. Is there any element of truth in this?
I'm not privy to the mindset of those who made that decision, so that it's not really within my means to say what exactly they were thinking. I would just like to caution Nigerians that it's better we face government policies squarely as bad policies that need to be resisted, instead of reading ethnic connotations into them. Because I think that the tension in the country is almost to a boiling point. And what we need is to unite oppressed people to fight their common enemy. Having said that, I received the news actually of the reduction of the cutoff marks to 120 and 100, you know, with shock and disbelief, just like other people. And what we have decided to do with my organization, within my organization now, is to study that decision before we make what I would call a full official statement. But even at that, I can still offer a few words, which is that it appears to me that those who are in charge of the education sector in this country have completely lost it. Because if they haven't, the expectation anywhere is that we want to make progress. And when it comes to education sector and the performance of students at whatever level is a major marker of the progress of that society. So that where you have high-flying students who comes out with high-flying grades, you know, the feeling is always that it's a society that has invested enough in education is reaping the bountiful harvest. So that where you then have a country that lowers its requirement below the level it had maintained for decades, it's an open admission of two things. One, which we have always suspected, that public education in this country has completely collapsed. What we have is just a shell. Two, it's also an open admission that this government has no plan or intention to redeem it. Because if you have an intention to redeem a bad situation, you would be working assiduously to make the proper investment to resolve the issue. Because the implication of this thing is actually bigger than we can imagine now. It means that we are saying that our education system is not progressing, it's retrogressing. We can no more maintain the same standards. And you know what that means for our dreams of developing a productive economy, you know, competing with other nations in the 21st century in areas of science and technology, a period when countries are thinking of how to explore space. We are reducing the cutoff marks for admission to our universities. So these are very worrisome indicators, you know, of the worsening crisis, you know, of this country. And I think that is also a wake-up call on those of us who have been in the trenches for decades, you know, fighting for a better education sector, that we must step up our struggle. Because ultimately, you have a ruling elite that is completely distanced from this problem. Distanced in the sense that you would have to go as low as the local government level, most likely, before you may be able to find a politician who would have his children in any of our public schools. So that it's not really of concern to them whether LAUTECH is short for 1 year or 2 years, whether ASU strike does come forever, and whether our education sector completely collapses. It's the same way and the same attitude they have towards the public health sector. The president of the country can fly himself out to London to treat himself with our money, while the rest of us have no other choice than to visit, the decrepit hospitals that you have all around. So I would just like to end by saying that Nigerians now need to wake up and say enough is enough. Because what has been done clearly now is to admit that we have no education sector at all. And we need to do something to ensure that we save it.
Mr. Juwon, how do you think that this change will affect the quality of graduates churned out from our educational system? I mean, we had, when the cut-off mark was at 200, our graduates were described as being unemployable. How much more now that it's 120?
As at the time it was relatively 200, the graduates are unemployable. Like you have rightly pointed out, it's an indication of a serious problem, a monumental one at that. So even the question of the fact that our graduates are unemployable too, you get it. It's not even really about. It's not totally even about the fact they cut off or the conditions that brought them into university, but even the condition that also brought them out of the university. That is for instance, can someone who graduates, graduate as you graduated in the Department of Chemistry, can you appropriately mix chemicals towards a productive end? It's another thing. Even while doing your projects, you will discover that you are going to do some test on virus in your imagination. So you are going to write down an imaginative conclusion, even in the final year, project. So there are a lot of, so both as we have it in the process of entering, the same way we have it in the process of going out. So the problem that we are faced with already, that 120, when you have it at 200 and now 120, aside from the fact that it will, in fact, number one, I could predict what will happen. Like, there's going to be a serious problem of increment in rates of people who are likely to drop out of the universities because really, how would you expect someone who scores 30%? In fact, globally in the world and even upon the establishment of the universe, at least before they can say that you have done the human's job, you must be average. You get that now. So that when you have someone who is entering the university with 30%, I don't know particularly how such persons want to cope through the rigors, number one, of even the university. So if such a person is dropped out of the university, you won't say probably it's not even solely because probably the university contains, as people would term, sadist or uncooperative lecturers, because the problem of such students gets complicated. Now, aside from the fact that even for brilliant and intelligent students, they still struggle to cope with abstract conditions, abstract conditions of learning. But for someone who in the first instance, has not been tested with a right cutoff mark, you can predict what's going to happen, as people call it. In fact, unfortunately for us, the economists described Lagos State as one of the worst cities to live in the world. It was after the war turns Damascus in Syria. So that even this issue of mega city, we shouldn't deceive ourselves. It is the mega city is another version of mega nonsense. So even in so-called mega city, people are sitting on the floor to receive lectures in secondary school. So what kind of persons, what kind of high school graduates do you want to produce in that condition? Such a person definitely, when he writes JAMB, cannot get 90. You get, let alone even 120. You and I, we are not just victims of it.
During the campaigns of Mr. President, there were issues of his WAEC results, and I remember a lot of Nigerians say they'd rather prefer a NEPA bill or a ShopRite receipt over his WAEC result, as at the time when it was such a big issue. And now we have the JAMB reduction at 120. And then I find it hypocritical that people who did take sides with that WAEC result are now, you know, coming out to cry against this. So I don't understand what's going on here.
You expect that I will understand?
Because I think you were one of such persons who sided with that.
With who?
With the poor results.
I wouldn't have. You know, my normal approach to such issues, especially when I don't consider them fundamental to issue of governance, is to keep my mouth shut, understanding that eventually reality will dawn. The problem of Nigeria, including the one we are going through right now, has nothing to do with WAEC result of the president. It has more to do with the anti-poor policies that he embraces. But don't forget that under Jonathan, Nigerians had reasons to cry and wail also. And Jonathan was supposed to be a PhD holder. I think that, yes, we would like to have very intellectual people in government, but we would also like to have people who would see governance as something that must, you know, ensure that the downtrodden, the working people, the young people, you know, are given a chance, are provided with jobs, education, and all of that. This issue of the cutoff, regardless of whether those who supported the president during the campaign are now opposed to it, we must make the point that it's a reflection, the cutoff mark, as I said earlier, of the entire collapse of public education, and the fact that, just like the previous regime, this Buhari or Sibajo government is as clueless and has no clear program to take the education sector out of the doldrums. This government has allocated 6% to public education. That itself is an indication that it is not prepared to resolve anything. So that if, therefore, following that, you now have cutoff marks dropping to as low as 120, the first question is that allocation to education dropped from 9% to 6%. More will drop in the coming period. Other standards of education, quality, as bad as they have all been, that we have been maintaining, will likely also drop. I don't know whether we are aware that Osun State, where for the past few years, somebody who called himself the governor has been claiming to have done the best anybody has done in Africa for education in that state, that state is trailing behind some northern states when it comes to performance in WAEC. All of these are to show that we don't have anywhere across the country government that are interested in actually doing the best for the education sector. Regardless of the individuals that are there, the unanimity is that public education is not something they should invest in. So that ultimately, what we need is for those of us on this side, you know, to realize what we need to do, which is to mobilize and begin to fight back.
There's an ongoing ASU strike. I don't know if Nigerian students affected by this strike are waiting for Charlie Boy and the rest to lead the protests against the federal government on this issue. But I'd like to know what the National Association of Nigerian Students is doing regarding this.
You know, the question of what the National Association of Nigerian Students, NANS, is doing on that, I think that is a question that should be best answered by whichever factions we have of the NANS, you know, leadership. You know, until yesterday, I thought we just had 2 factions. Until someone told me that now it is 4. So, so probably whichever faction you choose to interview, they could tell you what, you know, the national leadership of NANS, you know, is doing as a gather. But if there is anything that I know that it is real, you get it, is the fact that, not aside from the working people, the Nigerian students are being made to bear heavily, you know, the brunt of irresponsible government, and they continue to suffer that brunt because of inability of the organized structure of student movement, that is NANS, to launch a coordinated fight back. You know, we can't answer this question too without talking about the systematic way in which the NANS, the student structure, was killed. You know, both at the height of attack during the military regime, you know, and heavy monetization by the subsequent civilian, you know, administration. So that most of these heavy attacks, you know, majorly centered first around.
You're saying that currently Nigerian students are not doing anything to fight back.
You know, Nigerian students individually or on their respective campuses are fighting back. You know, but that is something that is quite objective. But you know, these pockets of little fight back, you know, they are not enough to combat the unified efforts of the government, because the government is attacking both the working people and their children, you know, in a coordinated manner, centralized, you know, around the executive arm of the government and that's legislation. So there's a united front, you know, against the students and their parents. But unfortunately, the medium of fight back with which the students can fight, you know, is in complete and total disarray. So it is quite near impossible for one student union or one student organization or one student platform, you know, to in a split manner to engage a government that is attacking you in a united front. So that what is necessary now is the fact that in this situation where NANS has failed to comply with, not just with its own charter of demands, you know, that is in defense of Nigerian students, you know, but to even respond to the yearnings of Nigerian students, then it's imperative that well-meaning Nigerians to civil society organizations, whether organized within campus or outside campus, you know, begin to mobilize students. In fact, student unions, at least the ready student union at that, you know, student unions that are ready to fight back, you know, they should begin to mobilize their students independent of the falling structures of NANS in a united fight back. And it's not something that cannot be done. You know, the recent struggle of South African students against Zuma's increment in school fees was arguably not done under the mainstream united platform, but there was an emergency sort of coalition within fighting student unions that you know, that was able to launch that fight back. And similar thing happened in UK. The students came together to openly decree the government's policies of commercialized public, you know, education studies. And here in Nigeria, you know, student unions and you know, pro-students left organizations too must ensure to begin to nationally mobilize students towards this fight back. And that's really the only way, you know, to put the student movement back to a fighting track. It is only within the confines of struggles against struggles against the attacks such as this that we're able to build the students movement.